Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Speech Spotlight Live. My name is Michelle Deutschman. I'm the Executive Director of the UC National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. If you're new to the center, welcome. We are dedicated to exploring the intersection of expression, engagement, and democratic learning, and considering what can be done to restore trust in the value of free speech on college campuses and within society at large. Today, we're going to focus on one of the pillars of higher education, and that is academic freedom. Lately, it's hard to read the news and not see a story about an academic freedom concern or controversy. Just this week, Scholars at Risk released their 7th installment of their Academic Freedom Monitoring Report, which illustrates the assault on ideas around the globe. And sadly, the United States is no exception. This week, we also saw a report by a faculty senate committee at the University of Florida detailing how fear of upsetting state officials led UF researchers to destroy data about COVID-19 and faculty to edit race-related references out of course materials. Add that to the disinvitation of Dorian Abbott at MIT and the storm over Bright Sheng's decision to show a version of Othello with Laurence Olivier in blackface, and there is much to discuss. Luckily, we are going to hear from 3 preeminent scholars, all of whom have expertise and firsthand experience dealing with issues related to academic freedom. They each have many accomplishments, and therefore their bios are long. And I'm going to take the liberty of shortening them so we can get to the meat of our conversation sooner. Sigal Ben-Porath is the professor of education at the University of Pennsylvania, where she's also a member of the philosophy and political science departments. She recently published the books Free Speech on Campus, as well as Making Up Our Mind, and she's currently completing a book on democratic erosion and renewal. Sigal chaired Penn's Committee on Open Expression from 2015 to 2019. Henry Reichman is Professor Emeritus of History at California State University, East Bay. He is the former AAUP Vice President and President of the AAUP Foundation. And from 2012 to 2021, he chaired AAUP's Committee A on Academic Freedom and Tenure. His book, The Future of Academic Freedom, was published in 2019. And this past October, he published Understanding Academic Freedom. And last but not least is Brian Sochek, who is a professor of law and Chancellor's Fellow at the University of California, Davis. Before coming to Davis, Brian served for 3 years as collegiate assistant professor and co-chair of the Society of Fellows in the Liberal Arts at the University of Chicago. Brian recently completed his term as chair of the University of California's system-wide faculty committee on academic freedom. I'm especially proud to share that he was a 2021 fellow at the UC's National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement. Participants, please feel free to add yours by going to the Q&A function. And now, without further ado, let's get to it. Hank, I'm going to ask you to kick it off. I think it's always good to go back to basics. What is academic freedom, and how does it differ from freedom of speech?
Oh, thank you, Michelle, for that wonderful introduction and for hosting this really terrific and important panel. Academic freedom is the collective freedom of the scholarly community to govern itself in the interest of serving the common good in a democratic society. It's comprised of 3 basic elements to which all who teach and conduct research should be entitled: freedom of research and the publication of research results, freedom of in teaching our subjects, and freedom of expression as citizens and as stewards of our institutions. Academic freedom belongs to the profession as a whole to pursue inquiry and teach freely, limited and guided only by the principles of the profession, and free of outside interference by trustees, politicians, donors, or college or university administrators. It's not a civil right like freedom of speech, nor is it simply an individual employment benefit provided to people in a restricted number of academic appointments. Although it grants considerable scope to the consciences of individual scholars, it is not mainly an individual right of professors to do whatever they wish in their research and teaching, or even to say whatever they might in public remarks. With respect to teaching, I want to point out that the academic freedom of individual faculty members can be limited by the collective responsibility of the faculty for an institution's or a department's curriculum. In courses for which faculty members are individually responsible, however, academic freedom protects an instructor's right to select the materials to be used, to determine the approach to the subject and the pedagogical methods, to design the assignments, and to assess student performance and record grades, all without having their decisions subject to the veto of a department chair, dean, or other administrative officer. Academic freedom is most similar to free speech insofar as it protects the rights of faculty members to speak publicly as citizens or to question or criticize institutional policies. But a faculty member's expression of opinion as a citizen cannot constitute grounds for discipline unless it clearly demonstrates that faculty member's unfitness to serve as judged by the standards of the appropriate discipline and the teaching profession. And such statements rarely do. Moreover, any decision for dismissal should take into account the faculty member's entire record as a teacher and scholar. Finally, academic freedom, most importantly, demands for its protection that faculty members are entitled to appropriate academic due process, and that hiring, promotion, tenure, and disciplinary decisions are rendered by qualified faculty peers, not by administrators, lay boards, or other outsiders.
Thank you so much. That was very clear. And I loved sort of the focus on a couple key things, including kind of collective responsibility, preventing outside interference, and the idea of peer review and disciplinary expertise. And so, Sigal, I'm going to ask you now. It's clear that both academic freedom and freedom of speech are exceptionally crucial to higher education. But in terms of academic freedom, who really bears the responsibility of safeguarding this principle, and why is doing so vital?
Thank you, Michelle. So I think in terms of who is responsible to do that, as is clear from Hank's comments, academic freedom is a professional tool that is meant to enable free inquiry, right? And so really the reason that we enjoy academic freedom is that so that we can pursue our academic goals. And therefore, it's a shared responsibility of members of the academic community. But broadly speaking, if you look at Hank's directives from a minute ago, if we are looking to shield faculty people, researchers, instructors, other members of the academic community, if we are looking to shield them from interference by politicians and by donors and by other parties who might pressure them, the responsibility for that really lands on the administrators and the leadership of academic institutions. At the same time, given that academic freedom is warranted by the pursuit of truth and by our disciplinary goals, there is really a very important responsibility also to our academic peers, right? To, I wouldn't say enforce, but at least to continuously utilize critically and thoughtfully the disciplinary and evidentiary tools that we have at our disposal in whichever field we operate to engage with us about our ideas, right? Because academic freedom is empty if we are not actually engaging around ideas and benefiting from our shared responsibility to promote our disciplinary goals together. So there is really, two aspects to the responsibility here. And I don't think academic freedom can really work the way it promises to do without both of them working in tandem.
Thank you. That's so helpful, because I think oftentimes there's, this misperception that academic freedom and freedom of speech are synonymous, and then also that really academic freedom is only supposed to be safeguarded by faculty members. And that's, I think, what you're showcasing is that it really is part of the shared governance. Brian, I'm going to kind of turn to you to answer kind of this sort of current moment question, which is, is academic freedom under siege in a different way than it has been in the past? Or is it more like we're just hearing more about the types of academic freedom issues that have long occurred in the academy?
So I do think academic freedom is under siege. just not necessarily in many of the ways that we tend to hear the most about. So to the extent you're asking, are we just hearing about things more than in the past? We are hearing about a lot of things, but they tend to be things like disinvited speakers, individual examples like you gave at MIT and Michigan, backlash against perceived racist or racially insensitive incidents on campus or in classes, the kind of breathless reports that any number of organizations put out about students censoring themselves on campus. These are the things that I see getting a lot of attention. These are the things I see in the New York Times and elsewhere. Meanwhile, we have 24 state legislatures trying to literally legislate how educators are going to teach American history and race. We have multiple states trying to, and in some cases already eroding tenure protections. And we have Florida, as you mentioned, treating its flagship university as if it's just a wing of state government. These are bigger, more structural problems that I don't see as much news about. And I think there's other kinds of problems that are just a lot less sexy than the things that get reported on. So, if you go to the individual kinds of cancel culture type incidents, FIRE released a database not long ago in which they tried to find as many of those as they could. And they ended up with a database of 426 incidents since 2015 in which people called on universities to sanction a professor for their speech. Here at University of California, FIRE found 16 of those. When I read through the facts, it looked to me as if there were 7 in which UC responded somehow and did impose some kind of sanction. So just to put that in perspective, that's 1 in 10,000 academic appointees at the University of California over the course of 6.5 years. See, that's not the kind of thing that strikes me as a crisis, especially in comparison with other, much deeper worries. So I don't know any professors that have been, I don't personally know any professors that have been canceled. I do know an awful lot of professors that have changed the way they taught or what they've decided to teach based on their fear of what students might say in evaluations. That's a kind of outsourcing of academic evaluation. When Hank and Sigal are talking about the idea of academic freedom being something about academic judgments being made by peers within your discipline. Many of the ways in which universities currently rely on student evaluations rather than peer review in judging our colleagues' teaching is in outsourcing. And there's other ways we outsource. Every university in this country almost is outsourcing academic judgments about admissions and how they're spending their money and what kinds of things, what kind of people they're going to hire based on how it's going to play with US news rankings. That's just a massive structural outsourcing of academic decision-making that's the kind of thing that really concerns me. And if I can just mention one more, the cancellations of individual events, if that's the sort of thing you're worried about, and you should be, MIT's cancellation of Dorian Abbott's event was misguided. It should not have happened. But I think Dorian Abbott is going to be okay. I'm not overly worried about him. I am worried about, for example, the adjuncts and lecturers and non-tenured faculty that most universities in this country are increasingly relying on to do the business, to carry out the mission of the university, because those people, if they say controversial things, might well lose their job. And that's not what's happening in the cases that we talked about at the outset here, the more publicized New York Times type cases.
Okay, thank you. So, Brian, you've touched on a lot of different things. We're touching on tenure, adjuncts, lecturers, student evaluations, outsourcing of the university. Hank, Sigal, do you want to just jump in and comment on any of these things?
Yeah, if I could, I want to pick up on something that Brian talked about, particularly with the question of when he said that Dorian Abbott will be okay, but what about all those people on temporary contracts? Now, I think even before we had the developments that Brian correctly highlighted, this legislation and these general attacks on curriculum and on tenure, is the problem has been the tenure system is so eroded that 3/4 of the people teaching in higher ed, if you include graduate student instructors, are not only not tenured, they're not even in the tenure system at all. And the result has been that, those people are often just dismissed on the basis of, well, their contract isn't renewed. And sometimes because no reason need be given. And so maybe they were a gadfly, a thorn in the side of people. We know of one case in the AAUP, a woman who was teaching for almost 40 years. She had been involved in an unsuccessful attempt to unionize the faculty. They found a small pretext of a rule, a relatively minor rule that she violated, and just didn't renew her contract. We have a case of an instructor at Barnard College who basically was dismissed and lost a grievance on the basis of not just student evaluations, and Brian is certainly right about that, but two comments in student evaluations after 15 years of teaching was given as a justification for this person not being rehired. When I think it's pretty safe to say that there was another reason behind this. It was probably her activism.
Can I say a word, Michelle, about the student evaluation matter, which I think is just important to keep in mind in the context of academic freedom? A lot of people blame students for breaches of academic freedom for faculty. So a lot of people suggest that it's students' oversensitivity or somehow refusal to consider diverse opinions that is really the reason for some of the concerns that we are seeing now regarding academic freedom. And so I just want to suggest, and maybe we'll have time to talk more about the whole, snowflake argument later on, but just directly to what Brian said, I actually think it's important to listen to students about their views regarding, teaching quality and instructors' commitment to the well-being and success of their students, etc. But I completely agree that this cannot be the only measure by which we evaluate either good teaching or the standing of a colleague and the renewal of their contract, especially those outside the tenure system. So students' views on an instructor, surely something we should consider, but other ways of supporting ourselves and our colleagues in being good teachers and assessing that, I think are quite important beyond just relying on student evaluations as a measure for one's academic success.
So we've been talking, or we're starting to talk about tenure, right, which is so quintessential. And not only have we already seen the erosion that Hank mentioned, which was having to do with sort of the adjunctification, which I think is actually a word now, of the university, but we're also seeing some other developments, like with University of Georgia system passing a policy that allows college administrators to remove a tenured professor with basically no faculty input. And so I'm curious, sort of writ large, what do you think is happening with the tenure system? And do you think academic freedom can exist without the system of tenure? I'll let one of you jump in.
Sigal, why don't you go first?
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, I'll go. I think academic freedom, first of all, academic freedom is not something that only tenured faculty should have. I mean, all those who teach and research should have academic freedom. The tenure system is just the strongest protection, especially if you're in a position where it can be backed up by a strong contract, and particularly a union contract. It's the strongest protection we have for academic freedom, and it really is not a reward for anything. It's just, once you've served enough time to prove that you're capable in the classroom, you should have have tenure. One presumes that if you were hired in the first place, you probably have demonstrated enough ability as a scholar. You have the scholarly credentials. But I think the importance, again, this goes back to the point I made at the beginning about the collective nature of the right of academic freedom. Without at least a sort of basic baseline number of people tenured in a faculty, the danger for everybody, including those tenured members, rises dramatically because faculty are human beings, and not all of us are courageous. Even among the tenured, whose jobs are fairly secure, the people can be cautious. So you need an adequately sized group to have the courage to stand up for those oddballs, those gadflies, those, dissenters, etc., who need the protections of academic freedom and may or may not be eligible for tenure. And so I think the greatest protection for academic freedom is not just the academic freedom for the individual faculty member who's tenured, but the presence of a tenured faculty as a potential, at least, if they do their jobs, protection for the academic freedom of everyone.
Thank you. Go ahead, Sigal. And I think courage is really a theme right now in all of the things that we're dealing with, both in the university and in safeguarding democracy, which is who is going to stand up. Anyway, Sigal, go ahead with what you were going to say.
No, I agree with Hank, and I just really feel that it's important to preserve really a diversity of perspectives and opinions and views that are openly and engagingly, exchanged and considered. And so really, it is, as I was trying to say earlier, a shared responsibility for all of us to make sure that what we are trying to promote is not purity of thought, but rather a diversity of perspectives. So the tenure system at its best, right, is helping us do that. And I think it's important to protect it and to continue consider the way in which it's affecting our work, right? So I worry definitely about Brian's comment about the University of Georgia system and other places where tenure is being eroded or even, revised in very negative ways, in my view. But I think that we can continuously consider what it is that it does for us. How can we strengthen it? How can we make sure that it really is providing the kind of safeguards that we need in order for free inquiry to take place?
And I'm going to build on this idea of free inquiry and diversity of viewpoints and turn to a question from one of our participants, a professor at University of San Diego, Farrell Ackerman, asks an excellent question, which is, UC's guidelines about academic freedom reiterate that freedom of teaching is constrained by an injunction against indoctrination, reflecting a teacher's favored positions. How does one identify the boundary between a teacher's well-motivated efforts to convey what they regard as truthful and valuable versus what might be perceived by someone else as indoctrination? And I think this is really getting at the epicenter of what people are accusing higher education of. Who would like to jump in and start?
I'd like to. I actually will just happy to read something from my own book, if you will, Understanding Academic Freedom, because I addressed this question. I addressed it more broadly, but I have a part at the end of the book of sort of concise principles. And I wrote, teachers must educate, not indoctrinate students, but instructors can assert viewpoints that remain controversial. Indoctrination occurs whenever an instructor insists that students accept as truth propositions that are in fact professionally contestable, without allowing students to challenge their validity or advance alternative understanding. So the difference between indoctrination and teaching is not that we have to make sure that all perspectives are presented, etc., but to make clear where in our respective disciplines, something is accepted broadly by everybody in the discipline as truth. That's not indoctrination. But to point out where some scholars think X, but other scholars have questioned it, is appropriate where the discipline as a whole has not broadly accepted as truth what people are advancing. But the scholar has every right to advance that controversial view, him or herself, as long as it's clear that the students don't have to accept it as truth.
Right. The main issue, really, I agree with Hank on this as well. The main issue really is not what the substance or the content of what you teach is, but rather what are the expectations that you have from your students in adhering, or what is the effort that you are making to persuade rather than introduce a certain viewpoint, right? So if a student is voicing or writing on their essay, exam, a different perspective that could be argued for, and they are making a legitimate argument for, are they going to be penalized because they disagree with you? This is where indoctrination comes in. And I actually don't think it's a huge problem. I think it is a problem on the margins, as with some other things that we're saying. And we should remain aware of that. And again, provide feedback to our colleagues regarding their pedagogical practices and what kind of expectations are appropriate from students, etc. But surely the issue is not content-based, as is with the current firestorms around specific content, but rather in the way in which you teach.
I would just add that I think sometimes the discussion about indoctrination is also about fears that professors are bringing in topics that are extraneous to their classes. The biology professor that just can't stop talking about Trump or something like that. And unfortunately, the most recent major opinion out of the federal courts on academic freedom is a case from the Sixth Circuit called Merriweather v. Hartop. This was about a professor who was held to have an academic freedom right to misgender one of his students in his philosophy class. And even if you take seriously the idea, which I don't, but if you take seriously, for the sake of argument, the idea that by misgendering her, he was expressing, every time he called her Mr., that he was expressing a view on gender, even if you take that seriously, what that means is that this philosophy professor was up there expressing his views on gender, his political, moral, religious views on gender in every single class, no matter what the topic of that the lesson plan was that day. And to me, that's just an astonishing holding, and one that I'm shocked the conservatives on the Sixth Circuit were willing to endorse, because after all, the critique there is that that's exactly the kind of thing that professors are out there doing, just talking about their favored political views at any opportunity. And that opinion really gives an academic freedom protection for such what I would call indoctrination.
We had a case at the campus that I'm now retired from, Cal State East Bay, recently, where an economics professor, actually a retired economics professor teaching in a post-retirement arrangement, was distributing materials and teaching what he calls race realism, which is essentially some bogus scholarship that people of color are less intelligent than white people or Europeans. I'm not quite sure exactly what version of the nonsense it was. And the interesting thing about it, of course, was when I was first informed of it, people asked my opinion as someone who knows something about academic freedom. My first response was, what the heck does that have to do with economics? How did he relate it to the course? And as far as I can tell from what I've heard, is he didn't. He was advancing his own personal opinions. That's not protected by academic freedom and shouldn't be. If there was a legitimate debate within his field around that, then he had the right to bring that in, but also should have understood that this is a highly controversial view, and therefore he should have felt obliged to let the students know that. But it's not indoctrination. It's indoctrination to just put things that have nothing to do with the class because you think you're important on a persistent basis. Everybody's entitled, we're all human beings. Everybody's entitled to make some odd comments here and there. I did it when I was teaching. I'm sure Brian and Sigal have, and probably everybody in the audience has at some point.
We have a lot of questions coming in, so I'm going to turn to one that talks about pressure that comes from department colleagues. And I'm going to use that as an opportunity to segue into one of the issues that I think is of particular interest, where I think some of the boundaries and application of academic freedom are not fully set, which is this idea of solidarity statements that either are made by an entire department or departments that support other people's statements, usually about national, international, social and political issues and events. And, whether that's in the context of racial justice and the murder of George Floyd or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there's been some questions raised about whether free speech rights and academic freedom rights are implicated when departments either issue or endorse statements. And I know that's come up at the University of California. Brian, I know that's something that you kind of had to think about in your role. Do you want to kick it off and just talk a little bit about sort of the hardest sort of version of these statements, which is when a department decides to sign on as an entire entity, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. I mean, I think these statements are far more common than we tend to acknowledge. So just to give an example, I looked before this session at the UC Davis Department of Philosophy. The very first thing on the website, the very top of the website is the UC Davis Department of Philosophy condemns the anti-Asian racism and violence that have affected our state and country. It gives some resources for students who would like support. And then it says, we believe that philosophy as a field of study has much to contribute to the projects of understanding racism and opposing it. Now, that's the kind of example that I think if you go through department by department and look at their websites, close to the majority, I would say, have some kind of political type statement there. Some of them are coming from the department, as the one I just read. Some are coming from the chair or dean of the school, speaking for him or herself. Some are phrased in terms of the faculty of Department X condemn. So the faculty of the Department of Philosophy condemn. Some say things like the undersigned faculty, or just have a list of actual faculty members that sign on to something. And all of these raise different challenges because when it's the department speaking, that's an administrative unit of the university. And so there's real concerns that have been raised that a department shouldn't be given the power to speak for, say, the University of California, that they're leveraging the name, in other words, for whatever political cause that they're supporting. That isn't as much of a fear, of course, when we're talking about the faculty of the Department of Philosophy, because that's a body of academics, not an administrative unit of the university. And those kinds of technicalities may actually turn out to matter a lot here. The safest thing is just for people to list their own names and have a list of the signatories. That has no academic freedom, First Amendment type problems at all. That's clearly protected under both. And yet, I just think it's worth noting that that might also be the case in which the chilling concerns are the strongest. So that's to say, there's any number of recent statements after George Floyd's murder, for example, where a dean of a law school has said, I'm signing this statement in favor of greater anti-racist efforts and condemning the killing of George Floyd. And I call on all of my colleagues and students to sign on as well. Well, I would actually feel as an individual faculty member far more coercion to sign on to a statement like that, to put my name on that statement, then I would feel somehow coerced by the fact that my dean released a statement, which I don't think people standardly ascribe to me any of the positions that my dean takes. And I'm not overly worried that if I were to speak out with a slightly different position that I'm going to be retaliated against. Whereas, the call to sign on to a statement personally comes with a different set of pressures, even though if formally it's a far less problematic thing from an institutional perspective. So these are tough issues.
Yeah, I mean, as lawyers know, the devil's often in the details, and I think that's what this is going to be about. I think you make some great points. What about, let's go with some of the things that happened during the recent department signing some Palestinian solidarity statements. What happens to the person in the department that doesn't feel that comfortable? What kind of democratic processes might be utilized when signing on behalf of an academic body? Sigal, do you have any thoughts on that, Hank?
Right. So I think, we talked about courage before. And so I think it's important to also consider the way in which we use our secure positions, especially those of us who are tenured, to advance our perspectives or to support others whose perspectives may be silenced or who may carry the burden of departments and schools and universities expressing views that they don't share. I think it's really important to keep in mind what Brian was just now noting, which is that mission statements and departmental statements are often not seen as incorporating within them the perspective of every single individual member within the unit that's relevant. But I also think that there is something in these statements similar even to circulating requests to sign on petitions or expressions of concern or of a certain belief. I have a little bit of a concern that these are cheapening sometimes the usage of academic freedom in ways that really are not conducive to protecting the broad boundaries of free inquiry. So to some extent, slap your signature on this and that and the other thing, sort of like show your commitment to whichever is the virtue of the day. I think it is something that is actually concerning in both types of statements that Brian mentioned, right? So both in the department supports whatever, and in I call on all my colleagues to sign this and that. I think both of these have reached a point in the last 2 years where they start to become, treated a little bit like spam, like people don't have the same force because they come in too quick of a succession. And so I think they should really be reserved to issues that demand a clear commitment and attention. That's, of course, very hard to judge when that is the case, but also to cases that are clearly and explicitly aligned with the core mission of the department or the university. I really don't think every single unit or department needs to express its views about every single important public matter, right? Who cares what the philosophy department at UC Davis thinks about this? Or my department, right? I mean, it's definitely not personal, right? So you need to choose the times in which you make these broad statements.
Right.
I very much agree with what Sigal just said, because I think that there's a distinction that we need to make in all academic freedom and free speech cases between what is permissible and what is advisable. And I think it's fine for departments, especially if there is unanimity or a very strong thing, to take a position on an issue, especially if it's related to their discipline, but even if it isn't. But it's not always advisable. And some of it is, as Sigal pointed out, is just performative. Well, we said it, we issued a statement, now I can go back to life as normal. And I'm actually a little bit more concerned about that performativity when it comes to universities and administrations who are quite eager to take on some performative, action against in a particular violation of something, or issuing a formal statement, but not really doing the hard work of figuring out what kind of university policies can we enact that would address this issue more meaningfully than just simply saying we're the good guys on this.
Right. I think we're adding in the layer of, possible dilution of message. I'm really excited by the level of engagement, so I'm going to continue down the queue of questions. Steve Brody asking an excellent question, which is kind of piggybacking on this discussion of state legislators trying to restrict teaching. And so how do we translate the value of academic freedom for parents and voters? Why should they care? I think that's a great question.
Can I just say, I think this is really where all of this this is what it comes down to, right? Academic institutions are a part of a host of institutions, including the press and to some extent the courts, that are really embroiled or entangled in the culture wars right now. And there are various reasons to that, which are reflective of the ways in which our shared foundations of democracy and of knowledge are eroded or are backsliding. And so really, I think the most important takeaway that anyone who cares about academic freedom has to take from this and similar conversations is that we have to be intentional and explicit about communicating what it is that we do, why free inquiry is, as Hank started us off with, a benefit to the common good, right? What's in it for everyone? And I think really university leaders, as well as other members of the community, such as ourselves, again, especially tenured ones, but really anyone who operates within a university system and cares about it and feels that it's a benefit, needs to be explicit about it. We actually do this work for the public benefit. Academic freedom is something that is of use to everyone in that it advances science and knowledge and understanding. Freedom of speech is what we do in these institutions, right? So, okay, we have to improve on the margins in various ways that we're discussing, but communicating our mission and its public value, I think, is really a crucial aspect of protecting academic freedom.
Can I just combine this answer with the question that Taylor asks below about, do you think media outlets' perpetual narratives when discussing protection of free speech are doing more harm than good? Because I think that goes to Stephen's question as well. And I think the answer is absolutely yes. So both media outlets and some of the organizations that are devoted to promoting academic freedom, I think to the extent that they continually repeat a sky is falling narrative, unprecedented crisis in academic freedom, where that's referring to things like students as snowflakes, students as, what The Economist said recently on the cover, the threat from the illiberal left, this sort of, rampant indoctrination and cancel culture. Well, if that's your view of what's happening in American universities, then no wonder the response is legislatures trying to step in and erode tenure and try to tell control what kind of indoctrination is going on. So I do worry sometimes that some of the advocates in this area are producing a narrative that then is directly leading to some real tangible academic freedom violations at a different level.
I agree with what both my colleagues have said, but I want to add one other element, which is I think for too long, for much of my career, university administrators, and to some degree, we faculty members ourselves have bought into the notion that the justification for higher education, including for public higher education, is the personal gain of students, their economic status. And of course, people go to college, they want to get a better life, they want to get a good job, maybe become a professional or what have you. That's fine. It's fine. Of course, it's part of what we do. But when we justify higher education solely on its economic benefits to individuals, we lose sight of the importance of the public good. And if that's the main purpose of higher education, then what is the point of free inquiry? What is the point of academic freedom? And I think we've lost, too many of us have lost sight of that. And I know in so many of the things, I've been in several campaigns, we're trying to promote the university, do fundraising. And it's all about, look at graduate X, achieved this, and look at this other thing that we did for graduate Y, and what about, or we'll tell legislators that graduates of colleges pay 5 times more over their lifetimes in state taxes because they have higher incomes, so therefore you should invest. That's not the reason. And I think we have to make the argument for the need for the public good for higher education, not just for job training and professional training, as important as those tasks may be, and insofar as they've been taken up by colleges and universities as well.
I think we're really kind of circling on a theme today, which is actually even bigger than academic freedom, right? Which is that what is the purpose of higher education and of a liberal education? And if people can't articulate that and aren't able to explain it, right, then all of it sort of erodes, right? That this is about more than social and economic mobility. And so I'm going to pose a challenge to everybody who's on today to be thinking like, if you had to do an elevator pitch to a friend or a parent or a kid about why liberal education matters, what would you say and could you do it? And while you're thinking of that, I want to turn to a couple other questions. This one I feel like is designed for Brian because his fellowship project was on diversity statements. Kenneth Simons asks, some faculty have expressed concern that DEI statements that universities request or require amount to a requirement that faculty profess belief in progressive viewpoints. Do you think that this is a genuine problem?
Well, I have an 80-some page article that I'd be happy to send to you if you want to email me if you're really deeply interested. But the very short answer is, I think there's ways of doing them, of requesting and evaluating DEI statements that are completely appropriate and useful, so that avoid the kinds of charges that keep being alleged that DEI statements are viewpoint discriminatory and violate academic freedom, or even constitute something like a loyalty oath of, harkening back to the Cold War era. My shortest answer is, I think the trick is that they should not be asking that, as you put it, faculty profess belief in progressive viewpoints. Rather, when done properly, they ask, what have you done or plan to do to ensure, for example, that a diverse array of students are thriving under your watch, right? And that, to me, is absolutely core to the job description, certainly of somebody like me who's a professor at a public university. It's often said that these DEI statements are adding something on to evaluation of a professor's scholarly or pedagogical merit. And I just think that's question begging. I think that it's not at all clear to me. In fact, it's pretty strongly clear that it's not the case that I could just go through and be seen as a great professor at the University of California if I never cared about how, an array of different diverse students, the kind of diversity that reflects the state of California, are doing in my classes, or thrive, being mentored by me, or, going on what their success is after they've been taught by me. And so I think those are the kinds of considerations that the university is well within its rights to be considering. And yet the point there isn't write a statement about how you think diversity is the greatest thing in the world. That's useless. It's easily gamed, and it's probably viewpoint discriminatory. And we have a great model of this. People write teaching evaluation statements all the time, where they give their scores, that's the student evaluations, and say what innovations they've done. I can write a very good teaching statement while still thinking, oh my gosh, the University of California requires us to teach way too much, and it's just a big distraction from my research. Those aren't incompatible. And in the same way, if diversity statements are properly framed, you could write a great statement saying all the things you've done to ensure the flourishing of a diverse set of students, while also thinking that perhaps the University of California or some other institution privileges that concern too much. Those aren't incompatible.
All right. I think, and with your permission, Brian, I think I'd like to send out both your paper and I think the Merriweather decision for those people that are more legal eagles that might want to delve more deeply. Another really interesting question from Sean Malloy that kind of harkens back to something that I know came up for UC and many other schools, which is the increasing reliance on third-party services such as Zoom and Canvas, and how does that affect the way we think about academic freedom on campus? I don't know if any of the three of you has some thoughts on that.
So this has definitely become an issue, especially when Zoom, the company, has decided to engage in some specific forms of censorship of certain invited speakers. And I think the concern came up a few times. So again, if we look at the numbers, they are not significant, but it's surely concerning when you see a private company that can influence the content of academic engagement or an academic event. I think it's becoming even more pressing given the international nature of a lot of our campuses. And so provided that many of our international students are coming from contexts that are authoritarian or where the government is not committed to neutrality regarding appropriate expression. And so if the platforms can really communicate, or in any way address perspectives that are voiced on the platform, then I think it's surely a concern for those of us who care about academic freedom, which, as I said, I hope it's everyone. And I think, obviously, despite Brian's justified concerns regarding the outsourcing of many of our, practices and evaluation measures, I don't see universities as being capable to, steer clear from using private companies in these ways like Canvas or Zoom or other ones. But I do think that we need to make sure that given that we are important users, that we really, and I see Brian is just mentioning the new policy, I think we really should have a say in the policies and the ways that they are impacting academic freedom as used on the platforms.
One other troubling element is that, like this session, of course, Zoom sessions and other forms of online education through Canvas, through Blackboard, et cetera, are often recorded, and records are kept in ways that they wouldn't be in traditional face-to-face classes. And I know it's been the position of the AAUP since 1915 that discussions in a class are not public remarks. They're, a private conversation in the same way, in a sense, that perhaps conversations in your home might be. And so the ability of the university or of outsiders, et cetera, to be able to access recordings of classrooms done technically, of course, with the permission of everyone, because it always says this is being recorded, it can be intimidating and perhaps could endanger the academic freedom of faculty members and the free speech rights also as well of students. And I think universities are not yet equipped well enough to address these concerns and figure out how best to manage them. So it's a challenge. I agree with what Sigal said, that it's unlikely that the universities will ever be able to do all this without access to private resources. But we need to, adapt these resources to our needs and, more importantly, our values, and not adopt our values to the resources.
And this is your comment, Hank, is going to lead me to kind of, I think, what will be our final question, because you mentioned recording, and I think it's hard to get through any conversation now also without incorporating the impact of social media. And I think one of the things I want to ask, and I know there's not enough time, but when a professor speaks on their personal social media account, for instance, I think there's a lot of questions about when is that extramural speech protected by academic freedom? When is it protected by freedom of expression? I know that's a big question to ask with only like 3 minutes left, but if someone wants to give the short version or things to be thinking about as you identify the difference between extramural speech and how it relates to academic freedom, I welcome that.
Okay, well, I'll take a quick stab at it. I'm putting aside the possibility that a given social media post may involve criminal activity. That just simply an outrageous thing. Something I wrote a chapter in my first book on academic freedom called "Can I Tweet That?" About what are you entitled to tweet. And I've always thought that I need a companion thing. Should I tweet that? Meaning, like, what's again this question of what's permissible and what's advisable. But I think pretty much anything that a faculty member says on social media, unless it directly goes to proving their unfitness to teach in the context of their overall record, should be protected by academic freedom. Doesn't mean it should be immune from criticism and condemnation. And I think that the best approach for universities and colleges when their faculty members are attacked and this is to simply straight out and say that we are not responsible for what our faculty members say in social media. They are exercising their First Amendment and academic freedom rights. And therefore, there will be no action from our university to discipline them. Threats against that faculty member or threats against the university will be addressed appropriately and resisted, period. That should be the appropriate response.
Either of you want to add anything else before we close?
I'm a little more permissive when it comes to the kind of counter speech that Hank was just talking about. And I know this is controversial in many quarters, but although I would be very much in favor of that kind of statement that Hank just described, to say, we're not going to take any action against this professor. That, of course, is appropriate. But I would also be okay, going back to the earlier topic on department statements, for the dean or chair or department to express its own views on certain issues that might be in conflict with, say, a racist statement that a faculty member made on Twitter. I don't actually think of it as an academic freedom problem for the department to say that doesn't express, that's not an expression, or that's contrary to our department's values.
I agree with that, but I just want to make sure, though, I think too often what we've seen, particularly not so much from departments and colleagues, but from administrations, is their haste to disassociate themselves from the content and dragging their feet on resisting the threat and protecting the academic freedom. And I think we also have to keep in mind, the more frequently a university administration says we don't agree with X, the more they're taking positions and implying that when they don't say that, they are agreeing. And you can go down a rabbit hole. But yes, I do agree that in certain egregious cases, it's important for the university, and maybe even more important for the colleagues in the department, to be able to say, look, we defend the rights of Professor X, but Professor X does not represent us.
Well, and to think, I almost thought that I got some of you to disagree about something. But the truth is, even if you don't overtly disagree, certainly the discussion is very rich. And sadly, we are out of time. I think that what we may need to do is invite all of you back to do a part two, a deeper dive into these questions, because an hour is not enough time to cover it all. I am incredibly grateful to the three of you for taking the time to kind of be with us today and to think through these things. And I want to thank everyone for joining us. This is the last center program of 2021, which is kind of hard to believe. This has been quite a year. This year, we brought you 4 Speech Spotlight live events, 6 Fellows in the Field events, and our annual Speech Matters conference. Our upcoming annual Speech Matters conference will be April 6th and 7th. You know, in order to make our research and events available to the widest number of people, our programming is offered at no cost to all participants. So if you've enjoyed and learned from our fellows and from the experts like the folks we heard from today, please consider making a donation to the center. We can only continue our work with your support. With that, I want to wish everyone a happy new year. Let's hope for better things in academic freedom and across the board in 2022. Thank you so much, and see you in January.